The Dustrunner was dying, and Ryland Voss was dying with her. The control console screamed warnings in 6 different languages, red lights flashing like a panic attack made visible, and the nav system had given up entirely, displaying nothing but static and error codes that scrolled faster than Ryland could read. Outside the cracked viewport, the frozen moon of Vera's edge filled his vision, growing larger with every second, its surface a desolate wasteland of ice fields and jagged black mountains that looked like teeth waiting to bite down. The ion storm had come out of nowhere, a wall of electromagnetic fury that had fried half his systems before he'd even realized what was happening. Now the Dustrunner was tumbling through atmosphere with failing thrusters, dying shields, and a pilot who was running out of options fast. Ryland's hands moved across the controls with practiced desperation, shutting down non-essential systems, rerouting power to the attitude jets, trying to coax the ship into something resembling a controlled descent. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cabin's plummeting temperature, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. He'd been flying cargo routes for 6 years, hauling supplies between the outer colonies, boring milk runs that paid barely enough to keep the ship fueled and his stomach fed. He'd never crashed, not once. That perfect record was about to end in spectacular fashion. The altimeter was spinning down too fast. 10,000 meters. 8,000. The ship bucked and shuddered, her hull groaning under stresses it was never designed to handle. Ryland pulled back on the stick, trying to level out, but the starboard thruster was completely dead, and the port one was firing sporadically at best. "Come on," he muttered through clenched teeth, as if the ship could hear him, as if willpower alone could hold her together. "Come on, baby, don't do this to me. Not here, not like this." 5,000 meters. The surface details were visible now, vast plains of ice broken by ridges of volcanic rock, no cities, no landing pads, no signs of civilization anywhere. Just endless frozen nothing stretching to every horizon. The Dustrunner hit an air pocket and dropped like a stone, the sudden deceleration slamming Ryland against his harness hard enough to knock the wind out of him. Warning klaxons added their voices to the chaos, overlapping into a cacophony that made it impossible to think. He fought to get the nose up, burning the last reserves of thruster fuel in one desperate gamble. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical scream, one of the struts jamming halfway, but it would have to be good enough because the ground was right there, and there was no more time. The Dustrunner hit the ice at a 30-degree angle, skipped once like a stone across water, then came down hard. The impact threw Ryland forward against his restraints with brutal force, the straps cutting deep into his chest and shoulders. Metal shrieked. The viewport spiderwebbed with cracks but somehow held. The ship skidded across the frozen surface, carving a long, ugly scar through the ice, spinning sideways, tumbling, the world outside the viewport a chaotic blur of white and black and more white. Ryland squeezed his eyes shut and held on, his entire body tensed for the final impact that would either kill him or leave him broken. The Dustrunner hit something, a ridge, a boulder, something solid, and flipped, rolling twice before finally, mercifully, coming to rest on her side. For a long moment, Ryland just hung there in his harness, sideways relative to what his inner ear insisted was down, breathing hard, staring at nothing. His hands were shaking. His ears were ringing from the klaxons which had finally gone silent. The control console was completely dark, every light extinguished, every system offline. He was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. The realization hit him in waves. First relief so intense it made him lightheaded, then a surge of hysterical laughter that he had to physically bite down to keep from escaping. He took several deep breaths, forcing his racing heart to slow, then reached up with trembling fingers to unbuckle his harness. He fell the short distance to what was now the floor, landing awkwardly on his shoulder but not badly enough to matter. Everything hurt but nothing felt broken. Small mercies. The cabin was a disaster. Cargo netting had torn free, scattering supply crates across the tilted deck. Wall panels had come loose, exposing the guts of the ship's systems. There was a smell of burnt insulation and something chemical that made Ryland's eyes water. He needed to get out before something sparked and the whole thing went up. His emergency kit was still strapped to its locker, a battered duffel bag that had seen better days but held together. He pulled it free and did a quick inventory. Thermal coat, hand scanner, plasma cutter for emergencies, protein bars that tasted like cardboard but would keep him alive, and a water recycler that was probably worth more than the rest of the kit combined. The exterior temperature gauge, one of the few instruments still marginally functional, read -42 degrees Celsius. Without proper gear, exposure would kill him in minutes. Ryland pulled on the thermal coat, thick and insulated but showing its age in a dozen patched tears and faded panels. It would have to do. He made his way to the airlock, climbing over debris, moving carefully on the tilted deck. The manual override still worked, thank whatever gods watched over broke cargo pilots. The airlock hissed open reluctantly, and the cold hit him like a physical blow. His breath crystallized instantly, hanging in the air. His exposed skin went numb within seconds. He stepped out onto the ice and got his first real look at the Dustrunner's corpse. She was ruined. One engine had been torn completely off during the crash, leaving a scorched hole in the stern. The other engine was cracked and leaking coolant that froze as it hit the ground, forming bizarre sculptures of chemical ice. The hull was dented and scorched, panels missing, landing gear collapsed into a twisted wreck. She wasn't flying again. Not without a shipyard, a construction crew, and more money than Ryland had ever seen. The Dustrunner had been his home for 6 years, the only constant in a life defined by transit and temporary stops. And now she was just scrap metal on a frozen moon that didn't care whether he lived or died. Ryland stood there for a moment, mourning. Then the wind picked up, a howling gale that cut through his coat like it wasn't there, and survival instincts kicked in. He couldn't stay here. The ship's reactor was stable for now, but without power to the environmental systems, the cabin would freeze solid within hours. He needed shelter. He needed help. He activated his hand scanner, a chunky rectangular device that had been obsolete when he'd bought it third-hand 10 years ago. The screen flickered, glitched, then stabilized, showing a basic topographical map. About 5 kilometers east, there was a cluster of heat signatures. Civilization, or at least something close to it. Ryland checked the charge on his scanner, confirmed he had enough battery to last the trip, shouldered his duffel, and started walking. The ice was treacherous, slick in some places, fractured and uneven in others. Twice he slipped, catching himself on his hands, the cold biting through his gloves. The wind was relentless, a constant pressure that made every step feel like walking through water. His muscles burned. His lungs ached from breathing the frigid air. He kept his head down, focused on the simple mechanics of putting one foot in front of the other, not thinking about how far he still had to go or what he'd do if the heat signatures turned out to be nothing. Time lost meaning. It might have been an hour. It might have been 3. The landscape was featureless, endless ice stretching in every direction, the horizon a blur where white met white. Ryland's legs felt like they were made of lead. His fingers and toes had gone from painful to numb to a disturbing lack of sensation that he knew was dangerous. Just when he was starting to think he'd made a terrible mistake, that he should have stayed with the ship and taken his chances, he saw the lights. The outpost materialized out of the white like something from a dream. A cluster of prefab structures huddled together against the wind, smoke rising from a few chimneys, vehicles parked haphazardly outside, cargo haulers, personal transports, all of them battered and patched with mismatched panels. This was a frontier settlement, the kind of place people came to when they were running from something, or looking for something they couldn't find in civilized space. The kind of place where nobody asked questions, because everyone had answers they didn't want to share. Ryland stumbled toward the largest structure, his legs barely holding him upright. There was a sign above the door, flickering neon in 3 languages, the frozen edge, a bar, perfect. He pushed through the door and the warmth hit him like a wall of blessed heat. For a moment, he just stood there in the entrance, letting the feeling return to his extremities, breathing in air that didn't try to freeze his lungs. The bar's interior was exactly what he'd expected. Dim lighting, low ceiling, smoky atmosphere despite the ventilation, and a collection of patrons who looked like they'd been pulled from a wanted poster catalog. Humans mostly, but a few aliens scattered among them. Vrathari with their insectoid features and too many limbs. A Kelthon in a pressurized mobility suit. All of them hard-looking, scarred, the kind of people who'd seen too much and survived anyway. They glanced at Rylan as he entered, eyes cold and assessing, then returned to their drinks and quiet conversations. He was clearly not a threat, just another broke spacer with nowhere else to go. Rylan made his way to the bar on unsteady legs, dropped his duffel on the floor, and collapsed onto a stool. The bartender was human, late 50s maybe, with cybernetic arms that whirred softly as he wiped down the counter. He looked Rylan up and down with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every kind of disaster walk through his door. "You look like hell," the bartender observed, his voice gravelly. "Crashed," Rylan managed, his throat dry. 5 clicks west. The bartender grunted, unsurprised. "You're lucky you made it here, most don't." He poured a glass of something amber and slid it across the bar. "First one's free." Rylan downed it in one gulp. It burned all the way down, harsh and unrefined, but it was good. He could feel the warmth spreading through his chest, chasing away some of the cold that had settled into his bones. He ordered another, this time paying with a credit chip that was running dangerously low on funds, and nursed the second drink slowly, trying to figure out what came next. The dust runner was gone. His savings were minimal. He was stranded on a frozen moon on the edge of nowhere with no prospects and no plan. Great. Just great. That's when he saw her. She was sitting in a corner booth near the back of the bar, alone, wrapped in a plain gray cloak that obscured most of her features. But what he could see made him pause. She was beautiful, but not in the obvious way that demanded attention. There was something subtle about her, an understated elegance in the way she held herself. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair pulled back loosely, and those ears, long, pointed, elegant. Not human. She was reading something on a datapad, her expression focused, but occasionally she'd glance up at the room, her eyes moving across the faces of the patrons with a kind of quiet vigilance. When their eyes met across the crowded bar, Rylan felt something shift. She didn't look away. Neither did he. There was a moment of connection, brief but undeniable, and then she smiled. It was a small smile, hesitant, almost shy, like she wasn't quite sure if it was okay to acknowledge him. Rylan, exhausted and half frozen and completely out of his depth, smiled back. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the warmth of the bar, the relief of being alive, or maybe it was just that her smile was the first genuine thing he'd seen all day. Whatever the reason, something in that exchange felt important. She set down her datapad, stood gracefully, and began walking toward him. Rylan's heart did something complicated in his chest. He had no idea what was about to happen, but for the first time since the crash, he felt like maybe his luck was about to change. The woman reached Rylan's table and stopped, tilting her head slightly as she regarded him. Up close, she was even more striking. Her eyes were a deep violet, unusual even for non-humans, and they held an intelligence that felt old, like she'd seen more than any person should have to see. Her skin had a faint luminescence to it, barely noticeable in the bar's dim lighting but present nonetheless. Those long, pointed ears were adorned with simple silver cuffs, nothing ostentatious, just enough to draw attention to their elegant shape. "You look like you've had a long day," she said. Her voice was soft, melodic, with an accent that Rylan couldn't place. Actually, it wasn't that he couldn't place it, it was that she didn't have one. She spoke universal standard with perfect clarity. as if it were her native tongue, but something about the way she formed words suggested it was one of many languages she spoke with equal fluency. Rylan laughed, a tired sound that held more exhaustion than humor. That's putting it mildly. Crashed my ship about 5 kilometers from here. Barely made it through the cold. So yeah, long day. Her expression shifted, concern flickering across her features. That's fortunate. Most people who crash on Vera's edge don't survive the walk. Tell me about it. The bartender told me the same thing. I'm starting to think I used up all my luck just getting here. She gestured to the empty seat across from him. May I sit? Rylan was surprised by the request. Most people in places like this didn't bother with formalities, but he nodded, gesturing to the seat. Be my guest. She sat with a fluid grace that seemed out of place in the rough surroundings, folding her hands on the table in front of her. She studied him with those violet eyes, her gaze direct but not uncomfortable. What's your name? Rylan Voss. And yours? She hesitated just for a moment and something flickered across her face, uncertainty, maybe, or caution. Call me whatever you like, she said finally. Rylan raised an eyebrow. That's mysterious. Don't you have a name? Of course, but names carry weight, and sometimes it's nice to be without that weight for a while. He didn't know what to make of that answer, but something about the sadness in her eyes made him decide not to push. All right. I'll just call you Mystery then. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. I suppose I've been called worse. They talked. It started with small things, Rylan explaining the crash in more detail, embellishing the story with self-deprecating humor about his terrible luck and the Dust Runner's equally terrible maintenance record. She listened with genuine interest, laughing at his jokes, asking questions that showed she actually understood the technical aspects of what he was describing. When he mentioned the ion storm, she nodded knowingly. Those storms are unpredictable in this sector. The magnetic fields from the nearby gas giant create interference patterns that can scramble even military-grade navigation systems. Rylan blinked. You know about astrophysics? Some. I've traveled extensively. You pick up things. What else do you know about? She considered the question, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the table's surface. Languages mostly, history, cultural anthropology. The ways different species organize their societies and why those structures often fail. How many languages do you speak? She listed them casually as if it were nothing remarkable. Universal Standard, obviously. Celestian. Vrethic. Terran dialects, I can manage about 15 of those. Kelthon Sign Language, though I'm still working on the nuances. A bit of Dravok, though I haven't practiced in years so I'm rusty. Oh, and Ancient Etherin, but that's more academic than practical since no one speaks it anymore. Rylan stared at her. That's insane. Most people struggle with 2 languages. She shrugged, but there was something melancholy in the gesture. Language is easy. It's just patterns and rules. People are much harder. What do you mean? She looked down at her hands. You can learn all the words in a language, understand the grammar perfectly, speak it fluently. But that doesn't mean you understand the people who speak it. Doesn't mean you can connect with them. Words are just proxies for meaning. And most of the time, people don't even know what they mean when they say things. Rylan leaned back in his chair, studying her. That's pretty cynical. She met his eyes. Is it? Or is it just honest? Fair point. They kept talking, and the conversation flowed with an ease that surprised Rylan. He told her about growing up on Earth, in a coastal city where the ocean stretched to the horizon, and the sunsets painted the sky in colors that didn't exist anywhere else. She told him about a world with 3 moons where the tides were so extreme that entire cities were built on floating platforms that rose and fell with the water. He asked where she was from originally, but she deflected, turning the question back on him, asking about his family. He told her about his sister, Maya, who'd stayed on Earth and become a teacher. She was the smart one, he said. I was the one who couldn't sit still, who needed to see what was out there. She asks me sometimes if it was worth it, leaving. He paused, considering. I don't know if I have an answer. Mystery's expression softened. Do you miss her every single day? There's this gap, like there's a piece of myself that's still back on Earth with her, and I'm out here carrying around this hole where that piece should be." She was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, "I envy that." "Envy what?" "Having someone to miss." She looked at him, and there was such profound loneliness in her eyes that it made Ryland's chest ache. "I've spent so long surrounded by people that I've forgotten what it's like to actually connect with someone. To have a relationship that matters enough that its absence creates a hole." Ryland didn't know what to say to that. It was such a raw admission from someone he'd just met. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand but close. "You're connecting now, aren't you?" She looked down at his hand hovering near hers, and slowly, carefully, she moved her hand until their fingers were touching. "Just barely, just enough." "Yes," she said quietly. "I suppose I am." They talked for hours. The bar around them gradually emptied as patrons stumbled out into the cold or retreated to rooms upstairs. The bartender cleaned glasses and wiped tables, occasionally glancing their way but saying nothing. They talked about everything and nothing. Favorite foods from different worlds. The strange cultural rituals they'd encountered. Philosophy and ethics, and the question of whether free will actually existed, or if everyone was just following patterns laid down by biology and circumstance. Mystery was brilliant, Ryland realized. Not just knowledgeable but genuinely insightful, with a way of looking at problems from angles he'd never considered. But there was also a weariness to her, a sense that she'd carried too much for too long and was tired of the weight. Finally, the bartender approached their table, his cybernetic arms whirring. "I'm closing up. You two need to find somewhere else to be." Ryland glanced outside. Through the bar's small windows, he could see that the wind had picked up, snow swirling in the darkness. The temperature had probably dropped another 10 degrees. He had nowhere to go. The dust runner was a frozen wreck, and he didn't have the credits for a room. Mystery stood, wrapping her cloak around herself. "I have a cabin nearby. It's small, but it's warm. You're welcome to stay the night." Ryland hesitated. He didn't know her. Didn't know if this was charity or something else. But the alternative was freezing to death in a ruined ship or trying to sleep on the street, and neither of those options seemed particularly appealing. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose." She smiled, and there was something vulnerable in it, like she was taking a risk by making the offer. "I'm sure. Besides, she paused, choosing her words carefully. "I haven't had a real conversation in longer than I care to admit. I'd like it to continue if you're willing." Ryland grabbed his duffel and stood. "Then lead the way, Mystery." They left the bar together, stepping out into the freezing night. The wind hit them immediately, a wall of cold that made Ryland's eyes water. Mystery didn't seem bothered, walking with steady confidence through the narrow streets of the outpost. Her cloak billowed behind her, and in the dim light from the buildings, she looked almost ethereal, like something from a myth. The cabin was on the edge of the settlement, small and unassuming, built from the same prefab materials as everything else but maintained better than most. Inside, it was simple but comfortable. A single room with a bed large enough for two, a heater that hummed quietly in the corner, a few pieces of furniture that looked well used but cared for. There were personal belongings scattered around, a few books on a shelf, a jacket hanging on a hook, a small collection of what looked like souvenirs from different worlds, but nothing that told Ryland anything definitive about who she was. Mystery gestured to the bed. "You take it, I'll sleep on the floor." Ryland shook his head. "I'm not taking your bed. We can share. There's enough room." She looked uncertain, like she wasn't sure if the offer was appropriate, but after a moment she nodded. "All right." They settled onto the bed, lying side by side with a respectful distance. She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'd give anything to be anonymous. To walk through a city without anyone knowing my name, without everyone having expectations of who I should be and how I should act. To just exist without the weight of everything else." "Why can't you?" Ryland asked. She turned her head to look at him, and even in the darkness he could see the sadness in her eyes. Because I've spent my entire life being what other people need me to be, and I don't know who I am anymore. Beneath all the roles and responsibilities, I don't know if there's anything left. Rylan didn't have an answer for that. But he reached out, finding her hand in the darkness, and held it gently. "You're you, that's enough." Her grip tightened on his fingers. "For the first time in years," she said softly, "I feel safe." "Me too," Rylan whispered. They fell asleep like that, hands clasped in the darkness, two strangers who'd found something neither of them had been looking for. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cabin there was warmth. Rylan woke to the sound of engines. Not the familiar hum of a cargo hauler or the distant rumble of atmospheric craft. These were massive, powerful engines that shook the ground and rattled the walls of the cabin, the kind of sound that spoke of immense power and military precision. He sat up, disoriented, his heart immediately jumping into his throat. Mystery was already awake, standing by the small window, her back rigid, her hands clenched at her sides. She was still wearing the clothes from the night before, but something about her posture had changed. She looked taller somehow, more imposing. "What's going on?" Rylan asked, his voice rough with sleep. She didn't answer. He got out of bed and joined her at the window, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The sky above Vera's edge was filled with ships. Not small ships, not transports or freighters or even planetary defense vessels. These were dreadnoughts, enormous capital ships that dwarfed everything around them, their hulls gleaming even in the pale morning light. Each one was easily a kilometer long, bristling with weapon systems, their designs sleek and elegant and utterly terrifying. They bore an insignia that Rylan recognized from history vids and news feeds, a stylized star surrounded by interlocking circles, the mark of the Celestian Dominion, the most powerful empire in known space, the civilization that controlled hundreds of star systems and commanded military forces that could reduce planets to ash. Soldiers were descending from the ships, dropping in formation using some kind of anti-gravity tech that let them fall slowly, precisely, touching down in perfect ranks around the outpost. Their armor was ornate, decorated with intricate etchwork and inlaid metals, but Rylan could see the functional aspects beneath the ceremony: energy shields, integrated weapon systems, sensor arrays. These weren't parade ground soldiers. These were elite warriors, and there were hundreds of them. The entire outpost had gone silent. Rylan could see people emerging from buildings, their faces pale with shock and fear. One by one, they were dropping to their knees, heads bowed. Even the hardened smugglers and mercenaries from the bar, people who didn't bow to anyone, were kneeling. "This isn't happening," Rylan said, his voice barely a whisper. "This can't be happening." Mystery turned away from the window. When she spoke, her voice was steady, composed, but there was pain beneath it. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." "For what to happen?" Rylan demanded, his voice rising. "Who are you?" Before she could answer, the cabin door burst open. Soldiers poured in, moving with practiced efficiency, securing the room in seconds. They were imposing in their armor, faceless behind helmets that gleamed with heads-up displays, but they didn't point their weapons at Rylan. Instead, they took up positions around the room, standing at attention. A commander entered last, his helmet retracting with a soft hiss to reveal a stern face marked by scars and decades of service. His eyes found Mystery immediately, and he dropped to one knee, his armored fist pressed to his chest in a salute. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying absolute deference, "we've secured the perimeter. The fleet is standing by for your orders." "Your Majesty." The words echoed in Rylan's head, not making sense. He looked at Mystery, at the woman he'd spent the night talking with, laughing with, sharing his dreams with. She was no longer wearing the plain gray cloak. At some point, he hadn't even noticed when, she changed into robes of deep crimson and gold, the fabric flowing around her with impossible grace. Her hair was styled differently, pulled back in an elaborate arrangement that emphasized the elegant lines of her face. Those long pointed ears, which he'd found beautiful in their simplicity last night, were now adorned with circlets of platinum that caught the light. She looked regal, she looked powerful, she looked like someone who ruled empires. "This isn't real," Ryland said weakly. "This is a dream. I'm still in the dust runner, frozen, hallucinating." Mystery, no, not mystery anymore, stepped forward. The soldiers remained kneeling, their heads bowed. She looked at Rylan, and for a moment the mask slipped. He saw guilt in her eyes and fear and desperate hope. "Lower your weapons," she commanded. Her voice had changed too. Still melodic, still carrying that ageless quality, but now there was authority in it, the kind of authority that came from decades of absolute power. The soldiers obeyed instantly. The commander stood, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, this human, his name is Rylan Voss. He is to be treated as my honored guest. No harm will come to him. Do you understand?" The commander's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty. Escort him to the flagship. Treat him with the respect due to someone under my personal protection." The soldiers moved toward Rylan, their movements precise but not threatening. He took a step back instinctively, his mind racing. "Wait. No, I don't. What is this? I don't understand." The queen, moved toward him, and for a moment he saw the woman from the bar again, the one who'd admitted she didn't know who she was beneath all the expectations. "Please," she said quietly, her voice meant only for him. "Trust me, I'll explain everything. But right now you need to go with them. They won't hurt you. I promise." Rylan wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers, but the soldiers were already surrounding him, gently but firmly guiding him toward the door. He looked back at her one last time. She was standing in the center of the cabin, surrounded by her guards and advisors who had appeared from somewhere, all of them kneeling or standing at attention. But her eyes were on him, and in them he saw the same loneliness that had been there last night, the same desperate need for connection. The commander led Rylan outside. The outpost was in chaos, though it was a strangely quiet chaos. Everyone was kneeling. The streets that had been rough and lawless just hours ago were now filled with soldiers in perfect formation. Transport shuttles were landing, sleek craft that looked more like works of art than military vehicles. Rylan was led to one of the shuttles, the soldiers forming a protective cordon around him. People were staring, their expressions ranging from confusion to terror to something like awe. Who did they think he was? Why was he being treated like this? The shuttle's interior was impossibly luxurious. The seats were cushioned, the air was warm and scented with something pleasant, and there were attendants, actual attendants waiting to serve him. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, offered him a drink. He took it automatically, his hands shaking. The shuttle lifted off with barely a whisper of sound, rising smoothly through the atmosphere. Through the viewport, Rylan could see the dreadnoughts in formation, hanging in orbit like silent giants. The flagship was the largest, its hull adorned with more of that intricate etchwork, its name written in Celestian script that Rylan couldn't read. They docked in a hangar bay that was larger than any building Rylan had ever been inside. Soldiers lined the walls, standing at perfect attention. He was escorted through corridors that gleamed like polished mirrors, past rooms filled with technology that looked centuries ahead of anything Earth had developed. Everything was clean, elegant, beautiful in a way that made his rough clothes and worn boots feel like an insult. They brought him to a suite. Calling it a room would have been an insult to the space. It was enormous, with a bed that could fit 6 people comfortably, furniture that looked handcrafted from materials he couldn't identify, and a viewport that offered a view of Vera's edge below and the stars beyond. A bathroom attached to the suite had more features than he could process. The young attendant who'd offered him the drink earlier stepped forward, her hands clasped politely in front of her. "Her Majesty has requested your presence once you've had time to rest and refresh yourself. Until then, you're welcome to make use of the facilities. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." Ryland sat down on the edge of the bed because his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The attendant's expression softened with something like sympathy. "She is Seraphine Kale Vorley's, the eternal queen of the Celestian Dominion, ruler of 417 star systems, guardian of the Celestian Way. She has reigned for 62 years, and her word is law across more space than Earth has ever explored." The attendant paused, then added quietly, "And apparently, you're the first person in decades who's made her smile without calculation." Ryland sat alone in the absurdly luxurious suite, staring at his hands, trying to process that the woman he'd spent the night with, the one who'd laughed at his jokes and held his hand in the dark, and admitted she didn't know who she was anymore, was the most powerful person in the galaxy. And somehow, impossibly, she wanted him here, not as a prisoner, as a guest, as someone who'd treated her like a person instead of an empire. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry or scream, so he did none of those things. He just sat there, watching the stars, and waited for answers. 3 hours later, Ryland was summoned. He'd used the time to clean up, though he'd refused the formal clothes that had been left for him, sticking with his own worn pants and a clean shirt from his duffel. If he was going to face a galactic monarch, he was doing it as himself, not dressed up like some court functionary. The attendant led him through more corridors, past chambers filled with advisors and officers who stopped their conversations to watch him pass. Their expressions ranged from curious to disapproving to openly hostile. Ryland kept his head up and his eyes forward, refusing to be intimidated. They reached a set of ornate doors that opened silently at their approach. Beyond was a garden, an actual garden aboard a starship, miles above a frozen moon, trees with silver leaves that rustled in a breeze that shouldn't exist, flowers that glowed faintly with their own light, grass that felt impossibly real beneath his boots. The air was warm and scented with something sweet. At the center of the garden, beside a fountain carved from pale stone, stood the queen. She'd changed again. This time she wore something simpler, a long tunic and pants in deep blue, practical but elegant. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, falling past those pointed ears that were now adorned with just simple silver cuffs instead of the elaborate platinum circlets. She looked more like the woman from the bar, but there was no hiding what she was now. The way she stood, the way she held herself, radiated authority even when she was trying to look casual. She turned when she heard him approach, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Thank you for coming," she said finally. Ryland crossed his arms. "Did I have a choice?" She flinched slightly at that. "Fair point." She gestured to a bench near the fountain. "Please, sit. I owe you an explanation." That's an understatement. But he sat, keeping a careful distance between them. She sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. For a long moment she just looked at him, and he saw the same conflict in her eyes that he'd seen in the cabin. Then she took a breath and began to speak. "My name is Seraphine Kale Vorley's. I was born on Etheros, the capital world of the Celestian Dominion, 85 years ago. I was crowned queen when I was 23 after my father's death. I've ruled ever since." 85 years, Ryland repeated. "You don't look a day over 30. We age slowly. It's part of our biology. Most Celestians live 2, sometimes 300 years. She paused. "I'll likely rule for another century at least. That's a long time to be in charge." "Yes." She looked down at her hands. "When you're a queen, every word you speak is analyzed by 100 different factions looking for advantage. Every decision is scrutinized, criticized, used as ammunition in political games you didn't even know were being played. Every relationship is calculated. Will this person be useful? Will they be a liability? What do they want from me? What can I get from them?" She turned to face him fully. "I'm surrounded by people constantly. Advisors, guards, diplomats, supplicants. Thousands of people who all need something from me, and I am completely, utterly alone." Ryland felt his anger softening despite himself. "That's why you were on Vera's edge." She nodded. "I needed to be somewhere no one would look for me. somewhere I could just exist, without the crown, without the expectations. I told my security detail I was meditating in my private chambers and wasn't to be disturbed. Then I took a small, unmarked ship and flew to the most nowhere place I could think of. What were you going to do? Just hide there forever? She smiled sadly. No, just for a little while. Long enough to remember what it felt like to be a person instead of a symbol. And then you walked into that bar, and you looked at me like I was just another person. You made jokes. You told me about your sister and your dreams and your terrible luck with nav systems. You treated me like I mattered, but not because of what I could do for you. Just because. She reached out, hesitant, and touched his hand. Do you know how rare that is? How precious? Rylan looked down at her hand on his. He wanted to pull away, to stay angry, but he couldn't. Because he remembered the woman from the cabin, the one who'd admitted she didn't know who she was anymore. The one who'd held his hand and said she felt safe for the first time in years. That hadn't been a lie. He could see that now. Why did you bring me here? He asked quietly. Because, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I don't want to lose the only real connection I've made in decades. Because spending one night talking with you meant more to me than years of carefully orchestrated diplomatic conversations. Because I'm tired of being alone and you made me feel less alone. She pulled her hand back, giving him space. But I understand if you want to leave. I'll give you a ship, resources, passage to anywhere in the galaxy you want to go. No questions asked, no obligations. You can walk away right now and never think about this again. Rylan stood up, pacing to the fountain. He stared at the water, watching it cascade down the carved stone, trying to organize his thoughts. He could leave, should leave probably. This was insane. She was a queen, ruler of hundreds of star systems. He was a cargo pilot with a destroyed ship and barely any credits to his name. They came from different worlds in every sense that mattered. But he turned to look at her. She was watching him with an expression that was equal parts hope and resignation, like she was braced for him to walk away but desperately hoping he wouldn't. What happens if I stay? He asked. She stood, moving to join him by the fountain. If you stay, your life will never be simple again. My court is deeply divided. Some will see your presence as an insult to tradition, a commoner elevated beyond his station. Others will try to use you as a tool to manipulate me, and a few will see you as a threat to their own power and will want you gone. She met his eyes. It will be difficult, complicated, possibly dangerous. And what do you see me as? Rylan asked. She didn't hesitate. As the only person who's treated me like Seraphine instead of the eternal queen. As someone who made me laugh without calculation. As someone I trust, which is something I haven't been able to say about anyone in longer than I care to admit. She took a step closer. I'm not asking you to be a political pawn or a tool or anything other than yourself. I'm asking if you'll stay because being around you makes me feel human again. Rylan looked at her, really looked at her. Beneath the regal bearing and the centuries of authority, he could still see the woman from the bar. The one who'd been lonely and lost and desperately seeking connection. And he realized that despite everything, the absurdity of the situation, the danger, the sheer impossibility of it all, he didn't want to walk away either. I'll stay, he said, but I need you to understand something. I'm not bowing. I'm not calling you your majesty or following court protocols or pretending to be something I'm not. If I'm here as Rylan, just Rylan. Seraphine's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. Just Rylan is exactly who I want. They stood together by the fountain, the garden's impossible beauty surrounding them, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Seraphine reached out and took his hand, and this time he didn't hesitate to hold hers in return. There's something I need to tell you, she said, about what comes next. The court will demand an audience. They'll want to meet you, assess you, figure out how to categorize you in their careful hierarchies. It won't be pleasant. I can handle it, Rylan said with more confidence than he felt. She squeezed his hand. I know. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, No matter what they say or how they try to use you, you have my protection. And more than that, you have my gratitude. For giving me one night where I could be just Seraphine. For treating me like a person when I'd almost forgotten what that felt like. Rylan squeezed back. So what happens now? Now, she said, we figure it out together. She turned to look out at the garden, at the impossible trees and glowing flowers. I've spent 62 years ruling alone, making decisions that affect billions of lives, carrying the weight of an empire that expects perfection. And I'm tired, Rylan. So tired. But last night, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I felt like I could breathe. Like there was someone who saw me, not just the crown. She looked